40 minutes. So what I would like to suggest is that please show your hands for those who want to ask questions or give comments. Maybe 1 to 2 minutes, and please state your name when you want to ask question. Yes.
Good afternoon. I'm Husaini, a former Singaporean. I'm a Malaysian now, a social activist. I got 2 questions. Sorry, one is a suggestion. You said you mentioned about democratic country. See, when I was growing up in Singapore, we knew that PAP was always a social democratic party. Are they still a social democratic party? That's my question. Second one is Dr. Kwa was suggesting about having interaction between youth in Malaysia and Singapore. So I actually initiated one, and I spoke to the press club in Singapore, and they want to take up the case. And I also spoke to the Sultanah of Johor, Zari Sofia. She is willing to become the patron for the Malaysian session. I mean, I'm suggesting that we have 2 meetings, conferences or whatever, one in Singapore, one in Malaysia, in Johor. And in the Johor one, Zari Sofia will give some address and become the patron for the Malaysian meeting. And Singapore, we were suggesting to the Press Club Singapore to have Lee Hsien Loong. Lee Hsien Loong, well, by the way, was my schoolmate. We were in the same combined school band before, but he never mixed around when he was a kid, 13, 14 years old. He always was aloof, always on his own. So that's my suggestion. I was thinking that if anybody want to participate in organizing that meeting, can contact me, because I am very serious about it. That's all. Thank you very much.
Maybe I will collect another 3 more persons' questions and comments, and then I'll ask the speakers to respond. Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Aruna Salam. I'm actually a retired veteran unionist. I've been involved with the trade union movement for almost 40 years now. And I had a very good friend in Singapore who went missing. I think some of you might know Fei Kok, the former Secretary General of PIEU, which is the Pioneer Industry Employees Union, and also SILO, Singapore Industrial Labour Organization. And he was also the president of NTUC when the late Devan Nair was the Secretary General of NTUC. A month before Fei was arrested, I was with him having lunch in Singapore. His office was near the Kandang Kerbau Hospital. And he was charged for embezzling 100,000 Singapore dollars, which was equivalent to about 100,000 Malaysian ringgit at that time. It was somewhere in 1977. And after that, he was left on bail, and he disappeared. Nobody knows where he is now. I've actually gone around hunting for him, but couldn't actually find him. So when I saw this forum in the internet, so I felt a bit excited, because the stories are quite similar. Some of you have left Singapore and still are still around. But this particular person, Fei Kok, was a prominent unionist, is missing till today, and nobody knows where he is. If any one of you know where he is, I would like to contact him. Thank you.
Comments or questions? If you don't ask questions, these 3 panelists will hold the mic forever. Okay, so maybe we could ask Dr. Raman to respond.
As for the question that Mr. Mushahideen, is it? Muzaini raised, PAP labels itself as a liberal socialist party. They went one step further in the early days. Liberal, socialist, non-communist party. Why do you have to say, if you're a socialist, why do you have to say you're a non-communist? Because socialism is derived from the teachings of Marx. So labeling does not go very far, you know. You can say that Korea is a democratic socialist country. They call themselves as such. So the mixing of the word socialist and communist does not help anybody. If you are a socialist, you have taken the teachings of Marx, of Lenin, even of Mao Zedong, then you are a socialist. Some people define communist as a member of a communist party. So you can profess to be a socialist and yet not be a communist because you're not a member of any communist party. But to me, these two terms are interchangeable. If you are a socialist, you've got to accept communist philosophy. The teachings of Marx, Lenin, Engels, and of course Mao. That's how I would put across my point of view. I come to the next question. This gentleman asked about the whereabouts of Yew Kok. I hope I had the powers of the Interpol with me, you know. I'll hunt him down. He has embezzled money and he has fixed Tan Wah Piow. He was directly in link, in collusion with a man called Lawrence Quek, who was the General Secretary of SILO. I mean, if you're in Singapore, you know the scandal behind all this. They were fixing. Why were they fixing? Apparently they were carrying out instructions from somewhere from top. Who it is, I don't know to tell you. So he was a troublemaker. You know the story of how Tan Wah Piow got involved with the retrenchment research center which the University Students' Union set up to help people who are out of job. The American Marine Company, which made luxury yachts, laid off lots of workers. And before laying off, some of them were not paid. And demands were made that their salaries be paid. American Marines said, we have no money. Who came to the aid of American Marine? The same Yew Kok. He gave the workers vouchers to go and shop at the NTUC Fair Price departmental store. Who ran the store? NTUC. So this is collusion between the trade union and the employers. And the Employment Act of Singapore, which is a law affecting all employees and all employers, requires payment of salary to be made in cash, not in kind. What's the point in going to NTUC Fair Price? Can you pay the school fees from the goods that you can purchase from NTUC Fair Price? Can you pay for transport of the children who have to go to school? That's how bad it was. And the poor man got arrested for making demands on behalf of the workers. So that's a tragedy of the Singapore story as far as the trade unions are concerned. Where he is now, there are stories, but we don't know really where he is. He has gone underground. Thanks.
Just hold on. There. Oh, you want to?
Suggestion by Rosaini that we, I don't know, something to, there's the initiative of the Sultana of Johor and the Prime Minister of Singapore. I think I'll run a mile from that initiative. What I was interested in was the civil society that we've established in this country. We are what I call Congos. We are concerned NGOs. We're not Gongos, which are government NGOs, and we're part of uncivil society. So I would like to see in Singapore a vibrant civil society that we have in this country. And the two civil societies should have more and more interaction, you know. And nothing to do with Lee Hsien Loong and the Sultana of Johor, please, you know.
Just hold on. There's a hand at the back.
Okay, my question to the two speakers, two questions. Number one is, Lee Kuan Yew seems to have quite a grip on the fears of the people of Singapore. Maybe I just want to ask, how many years do you think that this fear will wean off the Singaporean people? Maybe once Lee Kuan Yew passed away. That's number one. Number two is actually a text from my friend. And he was asking, when can we see, or when can the panelists ever see a united opposition in Singapore, just as Pakatan Rakyat in Malaysia?
Talking about the straits, you know, if you ask people what is the stretch of water between Johor and Singapore, a Malaysian would answer that as Johor Straits. Okay? Agreed, eh? But if you're a Singaporean, the answer is no. It's called as the Singapore Straits. Okay, fine. You know, the straits, the water, either you call it Singapore Straits or Johor Straits, the water is the same, the fishes, there are many types of fishes there, are the same, the dirt also the same. When you get someone to fish into the water from the Johor side with any type of bait and line, hook, sinker, he'll get some fish. But if you ask the same fellow who fished from Johor with everything, the same equipment, the same bait to the Singapore side, and try fish from the Singapore side, he will never catch any fish. You try if you don't believe. Want to know why? Because in Singapore, even the fish, they not open their mouth. And not just... Sorry if they're Singaporeans, they might take offense. Anyway, okay, I got a lot more, but I won't tell you now. Wait, never mind. The other thing is, it's about religion in Singapore. Okay, the only religion that is monitored by the government of Singapore is Islam. And the MUIS is rightly under, I don't know which ministry, but it has always been a part of the government. Only religion monitored by the country is Islam. Why is that so, and the other religions are not monitored? Thank you very much.
I take one more question. No? Okay.
Well, I take the initiative to answer the second part of your question. I've been wondering the same thing. If you look at political science theory, they would say a system that allowed the winners to take all tends to produce a united opposition. Well, that's not true in Malaysia until recently. And there's the reason why originated the theory is say if winner takes all, then the opposition would unite. Is that the stake is so high, then there's only chance for the number 2, no chance for number 3, and so on. So the spoiler would be winnowed out. In Malaysia, it didn't work because it was not a chance for you to win. So therefore, the opposition preferred to be in their stronghold, their communal stronghold, rather than come together until when they see that prospect of power. I doubt the same thing would happen in Singapore because it's so far away until you can see that the opposition, I say, they come together and therefore they can actually take over. I think they would probably settle with what you have now. But if you're going to see a strong single opposition that can take over PAP, it probably would come out of the competition between the party. And the trend is already there. You see Workers' Party, no offense to supporters of all other opposition party, but I think the Singaporean Workers' Party are actually attracting more talents than others because they give you a better chance of winning seats. So in the long run, they probably would have winnowed out, and so you probably wouldn't see a united opposition in Singapore. It's just that it's so hard for you to think that there are more than one party that can actually win enough seats, and then they come together, and therefore they can win, and therefore they want to form one. I think you have you have too many political leaders in Singapore, so I think it's a different formula. It's winnowing out of the weaker opposition parties.
I'll answer both the questions. I'll answer Mr. Lee Kuan Yew's question first, the young man who stood up just now. And that's on the likelihood of there being an opposition party presenting a united front against a PAP. There are two ways in which this can be done. One is to have a loose arrangement. That is, the opposition party which wants to contest a particular seat does not contest that seat if another opposition party wants to contest there. It's a question of you reaching a mutual agreement. The other approach would be that all the opposition parties join together and put up a front called, you call it Pakatan here, you can call it United Front there. So you have the PAP and then you have the alternative. The term Barisan Alternative was used I think, in Malaysia. You can have that arrangement, but the trouble is, there has to be agreement on ideological terms on the question of personalities who run these different opposition parties, where they can sing their personal differences and get together. They are working towards that end now, and I think the day has come when they know PAP is not as strong, as effective as it appears to be. One internet person even referred to the PAP as an obsolescent party, no more relevant, and that may be so. So that answers the point that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew raised. The other question is that of Mr. Musaini, I'm so sorry, I mispronounced your name. Mr. Musaini, why only Islam is being monitored in Singapore? You see, MUIS, Majlis Ugama Islam Singapura, is a creation of statute. The law created that statutory board, Administration of Muslim Law Act. Singapore government is very sensitive about Malay affairs, about Muslim affairs. Why? Because in the north, you have Abang Malaysia. In the south, you have Pache Indonesia. So you've got to be very careful how you deal with Islamic and Malay affairs. What had been happening 15, 20 years ago was that the Friday prayers, which the Imam delivered, sometimes contained rather provocative messages. So the government required that each lecture or each talk, each sermon that the Imam will deliver must be vetted by MUIS first. Now, they are not sensitive about Islam alone. They are also sensitive about the proselytizing, the evangelizing mission that the Christians have embarked on. And they have sort of indirectly controlled or dampened the urge that some newly converted Christians have to want to convert people of other religions. I mean, religion is a sensitive subject, as you know. The Singapore Constitution, in one of the articles, I'm not sure it's 9 or 12, guarantees freedom of professing, practicing, and propagating your religion. Now, it's propagating the last P that is troublesome. A Christian can stand on the table and say, I want my Hindu brothers to convert to Christianity because Christ has shown us the way, we should all become Christians. Hinduism existed long before Christianity, long before even Islam. So it's a profound philosophy. To tell a Hindu, hey, you must convert, is provoking his emotions. So the government sort of says, look, you shouldn't do all this. That's why the Maintenance of Religious Harmony Act was passed in Singapore. So it controls all religions. Specifically, it lays more emphasis on Islamic affairs because of the obvious reasons I gave you.
Thank you.
There was, I believe, a question about the opposition and the question of how long and so on, the question of the grip on Singapore. I believe, we are not fortune tellers, and when we were young, we always think the future was bright at the time. But actually now we can be more confident that the tide of progress, it's moving very fast, and that moving, the speed with which things are changing, it's also because of the democratic demands, partly in other regions that are an inspiration to the young Singaporeans, and partly also is that the while the complacency in the past 50 years was compounded by the fact that there were economic progress and the target was achieving the golden grail. Now that we have achieved that high standard or high level of GDP, the issue of distribution increasingly is putting pressure on the ruling party and also the mismatch between expectations and what the government is willing or able to deliver. And that calls for policy choices which can only be resolved by having a democratic environment. And I think that that is the trend that one can see. And it's quite obvious in the internet as well. Thank you.
Hello? Yeah. Any more comments?
Mr. Dr. Raman may know the situation. What is the situation on the CPF Singapore for Malaysians, which they were demanding last time? Do you know anything or latest on it? Thank you very much.
If I remember correctly, Malaysians who had worked in Singapore cannot withdraw their CPF, even if they left Singapore, unless they're 55 years old. But there had been some moves to change this condition. How far it has gone, I can't say. I'm so sorry. I haven't updated myself. You just sprang a surprise on me. But I think it is still not possible for a Malaysian to withdraw his CPF until he's 55, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, one.
I would like to ask a question about how, Tan Wah Piow especially, how do you look at the question of how do you forgive and forget authoritarian leaders and the system? I mean, the question is, how do we look at those authoritarian leaders who have committed crimes, who have committed great injustice? Do we forgive or do we forget, or neither?
And the first question, based on all your view, will we see changes in this generation? Second is that, will the changes happen in Malaysia? The probability of happening in Malaysia is greater or Singapore? Because we are Malaysians. Because I think the scenario is quite the same. Both are changing. But based on the present situation, Malaysia seems to be moving faster. But we don't know what's going to happen, because there will be reactionaries coming all over the places. So just a little bit of forecast, so that at least whether this generation has any hope to see changes or not. Or it may be the third or fourth generation, I don't know. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Hello.
I just
what is the
thought...
likely outcome of the 13th general election, please? Your view.
I think there's great hope for change on both sides of the causeway. This afternoon, I brought a very young man of 10 years old to this meeting. And I think these things that he has heard today will probably reverberate in his mind, in his brains, in time to come. So I have great hope that the change will come. And there are songs of yesterdays which will be revived. And I'd like to sing to you guys, because I promised this young man that I will be singing a song. And I don't like to disappoint young people. This was a song written in the 70s, the time of Mr. Tan and Mr. G. Raman. No guitar, but never mind. We live in a land full of sunshine and beauty, mountains high and forests green and turtles in the sea. But freedom was lost when the white man invaded. Independence is a word that has no meaning now. Imperialism is not dead. Nation building is a fake. Hunger and violence are still the people's fate. Exploitation We must drive it from our land. Won't be long before that day, if our hearts are bold and red, freedom and laughter will surely come to stay. The sweat and the blood of our people are dripping into every rubber tree, now maybe oil palm tree, and every paddy field. But what do they get in return for their labors? Ubi kayu, rice and salt, and children old and gray. Imperialism is not dead, nation building is a fake. Hunger and violence are still the people's fate. Exploitation, we must drive it from our land. We all must unite in this fight for our freedom, working men and peasants and patriots young and old. No matter your color, your race, your religion, we are brothers joined together by our common foe. Imperialism is not dead, nation building is a fake. Hunger and violence are still the people's fate. Exploitation, we must drive it from our land. I won't be long before that day, if our hearts are blowing red, freedom and laughter will surely come to stay. Thank you.
Okay, this will be the last question, and I will ask the speakers to sum up. You have a mic?
Is there a possibility, given the sketches speak of reunification in a very, very distant future?
I'll leave the last question to Dr. G. Raman, and I'll take the other questions earlier. Firstly, see, Singaporeans, Patrick Loh is a Singaporean, my dear friend and countryman, and we have to come here to sing our Song of Unity. I've never heard him singing in Singapore 36 years ago. So, well, that's joke aside, on the question of whether how do I deal with the question of forgiveness and forgive and forget. As far as I'm concerned, firstly, something which is important to me, firstly, is we have to remember our friends. And some of the dear friends who helped me along the way, amongst them, we have Brother Hisham, whether he's still around, my contemporary. Hey, brother. And Raman Embong, he was around here earlier. Yes, hi. And Hamid Ali. Hamid Ali was here around here. He probably have disappeared. Now, it's important. Firstly, we remember our friends. And the second thing is, how do I personally deal with the question of forgiveness and forget? As far as I'm concerned, it's nothing personal insofar as Singapore is concerned. It's a continuing problem. So you cannot forget. You will still have to deal with it. The question of forgiveness, it's again, as far as I'm concerned, not personal. Whatever the man did, what he did, one is sometimes prepared to give the person the benefit of the doubt, to put what he intends to achieve politically in the best possible light. In the best possible light, one can look at the PAP, and in the earlier part of my speech, I mentioned that I'm prepared to concede that whatever our or my personal criticism about the illiberal character of the PAP government, how I detest that notion of hegemony of the one party, but I have to concede that they did certain good, and those goods are as in terms of housing, other aspects. That is important in dealing with a political reality. But where they go beyond the need of political necessity, and I believe that a person like the former Prime Minister has gone very much beyond the political necessity, where at certain times what he did were probably for his own personal gratification. And that, I believe, is not the making of a statesman. That is the furthest I can go in terms of any personal assessment of a leader. I believe I've answered the main questions. I'll leave it to you to deal with it.
Thanks to Wah Piow, he has tasked me the job of answering the last question. And that is a possibility of an eventual merger between Singapore and mainland Malaysia.
As far as the change is concerned, Singaporeans like to be on the winning side. Thank you. So we always sail by the wind of change, is it?
Well, purely on philosophical terms, change is inevitable. That's the hard truth of social evolution. It will take place. I cited the example of Persia to you and Libya. Now, the question that Wah Piow wanted me to answer was the possibility of an eventual merger between Singapore and Malaysia. The question of a political entity known as Malaya was on the manifesto of the PAP when the party was formed. And the manifesto stated that we believe in a democratic, socialist Malaya, including Singapore. That including Singapore was not in parentheses, not in brackets. It's an overt statement. That is how PAP started off its political activity. That means you're envisaging a political unit called Malaya. Historically, geographically, culturally, sociologically, we are one people. You know? Sorry. I have emotional surge when I talk about the folly of our politicians, principally Lee Kuan Yew. When the trouble started between Lee Kuan Yew and Syed Jafar Alba, both adopted a racist approach to sustain themselves in political power and political popularity. I don't know to explain to you. Those who were young may not be aware of this development. The conflict and the contradiction between these two personalities became so intense that there was a likelihood of riots taking place, purely on religious grounds. Tunku saw this. Tunku is a wise man. He called Lee Kuan Yew, Toh Chin Chai and Goh Keng Swee, and he said, this can't go on. There will be riots, there will be conflict, and there will be disturbances. One way out is that I send Lee Kuan Yew as Malaysia's ambassador to the UN. And then, he was serious, replace him as Prime Minister of Singapore by either Toh Chin Chai, who was a Malaysian by birth, or by Goh Keng Swee, whose cousin happens to be Tan Siew Sin. He had strong links with mainland Malaya. He wouldn't hear it. And there was no possibility of continuation of Malaysia as it then constituted. if Lee Kuan Yew were not to change his attitude. He ruined it. Tunku's dream was, let Singapore be the New York of Malaysia. Let Kuala Lumpur be the Washington of Malaysia. So that was 47 years ago when Singapore was thrown out of Malaysia because of the folly of one man. He may have shed tears, but they were genuine tears. That's a question. I can tell you privately some of the stories, but let me not go into that area. Today's generation of Malaysians and Singaporeans should realize that it's for the greater good of both territories to be reunited. But there are so many contradictions to be overcome. The main one would be the racial element, because at that time, race was an important consideration. Because Sabah and Sarawak were not yet in the talks about the greater federation. Only Singapore and West Malaysia, Malaya then, were the subject matter of the merger. The Malays here, or the ultra Islamist Malays here, felt that Malays would be outnumbered if Chinese Singapore were to join West Malaya. You see, this racial approach to politics and social affairs, social matters, should be avoided. But that was a card that most of these opportunists played. So the way out was to bring in Sabah and Sarawak, because with the presence of the Bumiputras of those two territories, the balance would be in favor of the Malays and the Bumis. But again, it did not work out. Again, because of the ambition of one man who wanted to replace MCA with PAP, which means he becomes then the Deputy Prime Minister. He wanted to be Deputy Prime Minister, eventually become Prime Minister of Malaysia. They could see the signs here. Dr. Ismail was a man with great vision. He saw it happening. So that is history. The future may bode well if the young people, the next generation after us, were to realize that it is for the advantage of both these territories to be reunited. Then I'm sure that will take place. Race becomes a secondary consideration, not a primary consideration. That's my answer.
I think, well, I was too young. I was born 8 years after the partition. So, well, separations, yeah. There's actually an interesting book published by ISIS called Greater Malaysia and Decolonization that offers a different, rather different story, which argues that Tengku's main interest was actually to acquire Northern Borneos, the three, Sarawak, Sabah, and Brunei, rather than Singapore. So there was a different kind of story. But coming back to the story, I think in 1965, what happened was that a separation of a pair of Siamese twins with rather opposite compositions. So in Malay-dominated Malaysia, eventually the affirmative action and all those things get reinforced. And in Singapore, the Chinese-dominated Singapore, you talk about meritocracy and so on. And this too has become in a way the justification of each other, of not to be the antithesis. What I mean is that, just a few years back, Singapore bashing is a national sport for Malaysia, and Malaysia bashing is one for Singapore, because they need each other. As much as they hate each other, they actually need each other to justify their rule. So in Malaysia, you heard UMNO warning the Malays and say, now, if you don't support us, eventually Malaysia will become Singapore, where the Malays would be sidelined and so on. And in Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew would say, now you'll be taken back, you'll be absorbed by Malaysians, and meritocracy will be gone. So eventually you have a situation as such. And that's come back to the question and say, now, will changes happen in Malaysia and Singapore? I think so. I'm quite sure that I'll definitely see in my own eyes. I don't think UMNO can last more than 5 years. If they survive these elections, which the chances is already quite slim, I don't think they can survive the next one. I don't think they can run full term. And what happened in Malaysia and Singapore would be, the moment one of the regime is changed, it would send shock waves to the other. Because you imagine that, let's say if Malaysia has a regime change first, and then that policy directions would be changed, would move a bit closer to Singapore. I mean, in the sense that become more meritocratic or less race-based, then the threat that the Singaporean PAP can do to the fear that PAP can propagate to Singaporean population would be weaker, because it's a different Malaysia. And the same thing, of course, if Singapore regime change take place first in Singapore, the shock would be great for Malaysia. If Singapore can even get out of PAP, which is remarkably much more able in running the country, why should you tolerate BN? Right? So the argument will be very strong. And there is actually a reason for the two regimes to hope that the other one to survive. So I don't really believe that, Singapore was actually keen in supporting Bersih and so on. They were just observing. That there were 3 diplomats who were actually slammed by Malaysian Foreign Ministry of interfering in Malaysian business. That's actually a joke. So coming back to this, but there's a difference between the two. I always say that it was an outcome of failure of a two-party system that leads to 2 successful one-party states. But there's a big difference between these 2 successful one-party states. The authoritarianism in Malaysia is very much based on prevention of violence. Because at the end of the day, they will tell you and say, if it's not us, we cannot guarantee that Malaysia won't sink into chaos. The Singaporean one was a bit more sophisticated. It's very elitist. We rule you because we're smarter than you. So you think that you're smarter than us, either that we send you to jail, we get you into exile, or we get you into bankruptcy. Or you just stay away from politics and so on. But that is being changed. I mean, you see that cream of the cream joining the opposition and so on in Singapore, because eventually what some people would consider that the Singaporean elites is some kind of meritocratic aristocracy, has a problem of disconnection with its population. That you need to pay them high salary for them to serve the nation. But in that way, you're actually causing a disconnect between the politicians, political class, and the population. So there's a big challenge of that, and in the likely chance that may be replaced. So I think that chances are quite likely. The last question, would there be a merger? I think that's a very, very pragmatic question. West Germany was willing to absorb East Germany because it was inevitable, but also that they slightly underestimated the price, the cost. South Korea, until now, is certainly not interested in absorbing North Korea. So for Malaysia and Singapore to reunite, to be reunified, I think Malaysia's development would need to come out to the extent that Singaporeans wouldn't think that they would be disadvantaged. So we have to be rich before our little brother would come back to us. And if Singapore come back to us, you can think about Brunei too. Thank you.
I have to end this discussion. If you have any more questions, you can talk to the 3 speakers here. Thank you very much, and can we give them a round of applause? There is tea at the back. There is a refreshment at the back of the room, I think. Thank you.